This Week in Defense News with Vago Muradian.
Good morning and welcome to This Week in Defense News. I'm Vago Muradian. Are President Obama's new ethics rules making it too difficult to recruit qualified candidates for top Pentagon jobs? And does the United States need a domestic intelligence agency? That's all later in the show, but first, can America afford both economically and politically to sustain continued combat in both Iraq and Afghanistan? My next guest says no and argues America must pursue a strategy of conflict avoidance. In Refusing Battle, the Alternative to Persistent Warfare, in the April issue of Armed Forces Journal, retired Colonel Doug Macgregor argues the cost of victory should be factored into every discussion about the use of force. If the price is too high, even if victory can be achieved, a military confrontation should be avoided. Doug is a West Point graduate and Desert Storm veteran who's now the lead partner in the Potomac League Consultancy who advises industry and the government. Doug, thanks and welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you.
The president is committed to withdrawing from Iraq to focus greater resources on Afghanistan, but you think we should get out of both countries. Why?
Ultimately, I think we've opted for the wrong solution in both places. First of all, we've adopted this notion of persistent warfare, which I think is a very bad idea. It's a bad signal to send to the rest of the world. Americans are really about prosperity and peace, not about persistent warfare. Secondly, pouring hundreds of thousands of conventional combat troops from the United States or Great Britain into either of these countries is a disaster. Iraq is hardly a success story. It's cost us $1 trillion, thousands of U.S. lives. 5 million Iraqis have been displaced from their homes, 1 million in the diaspora, 2 million in refugee camps, another 2 million inside the country displaced. This is hardly a success story, and quite frankly, we've replaced a Sunni Arab dictatorship with a Shiite Arab dictatorship. Now, I don't want to fight a war to reverse that, but I'd like to leave and accept the fact that, unfortunately, this government is now aligned with Iran. But shifting resources into Afghanistan is not the right issue either. In all of these countries, we're foreigners, and the people who live in these countries don't like foreigners. It's a huge problem, and they see us as an unwanted, intrusive element that is there to change their culture. That's not what we're about.
Well, it's amazing. In your article, you start out with a quote from Winston Churchill from September 1, 1922, a portion of which I'll read, which is about Iraq. At present, we're paying $8 million a year for the privilege of living on an ungrateful volcano out of which we are in no circumstances to get anything worth having. So the same factors that existed for the British almost a century ago exist now for the United States.
Well, we've been to this point altruistic imperialists. The British Empire was about profit. And by 1924, it was obvious to the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, that the national health budget of Great Britain was actually smaller than the cost of staying in Iraq. And at that point, he said, that's it. We're pulling the plug. We've got to get out. We've been spending hundreds of billions in pursuit of an illusion, the notion that we could, in a very short period of time, create Western-style governance in an Arab society, a place that's alien to it, where the conditions to support it simply don't exist. We don't want to repeat that mistake again. We need to scale back, pull out of Iraq, accept the fact that the people who live in that country will determine its destiny, not us.
And in Afghanistan, what's the right strategy there? The administration obviously is reviewing what the next steps there are. What do you think the next steps should be?
Well, there are a couple of things that we should look at very carefully. Understanding the criticality of not creating this overbearing foreign presence that inevitably offends Afghans.
They've never liked it historically, and they're not going to like it now.
Right. It's a unifying force that mobilizes them against the intruder. We need to scale back the conventional side. We need to think about the use of special operations forces and special forces in limited numbers, backed by air and naval power, who can work with people in that country who are willing to work with us, who share our interests. But we also need to keep in mind that the people we are currently fighting are not necessarily Al-Qaeda. In many cases, this is a loose conglomeration of people who simply want us out, who feel they want to restore the Islamic character of the country, which is their right, they're Muslims. And at the same time, we need to understand that Iran and Russia and India, who surround both Pakistan and Afghanistan, and you cannot see Pakistan in isolation from Afghanistan or Afghanistan in isolation from Pakistan, have far greater strategic interests there than we do. We need to work with them. We need to treat the interests of these other powers, whether or not we like their governments, as legitimate, because they do have legitimate interests.
From what you're talking about basically is realpolitik at its base in terms of getting it leveraged to advance American interests.
Yes.
And you've made this argument before when we've discussed that Eisenhower was the last president that looked at the traditional American foreign policy model of economic advancement as the engine for democracy and American interests. And we then shifted to moral fervor, which is what came after it. Why that shift, and what's it going to take to get back, as you argue, to that rightful core?
Well, one of the things that I talk about in the essay is that if you look at FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower, all three kept their eye on this ball of prosperity and peace. When they had to commit forces, they did so, and then they looked for the earliest opportunity to terminate the commitment of those forces on the best terms that we could get. They recognized that we had limitations. We were the greatest power. Certainly after World War II, we were the only one left standing. But they understood that those powers were not limitless and that we had to balance whatever we did with our military power against the requirement to maintain that prosperity at home. I think when Eisenhower left office, we were so rich and so powerful and so far ahead of the rest of the world. Remember, at that point, we represented 50% of the world's GNP. Today, we represent about 32%. The point is, we were so rich and powerful that we thought, as President Kennedy said, that we could bear any burden, go anywhere to promote our notions of social, political, and economic development, described roughly as democracy.
Let me take you now to the resource debate that's going on right now. What do you think are if you were Defense Secretary for a day, what do you think survives? Where would you be putting the investment?
Well, I think the first thing we have to understand is we don't live in the world of 50 years ago. The world is not packed full of enemies arming themselves to the teeth with the object of attacking and destroying us. It simply isn't true. This Islamist threat is real, but it's very, very minor in the grand scheme of things. It's not existential. There are many ways to cope with it. We have to think about security here in the United States, and we need to work with people abroad. It doesn't have to be an existential threat. We don't have to spend billions to deal with it. What we should focus on is the fact that we have forces all over the world in many, many places where, quite frankly, they're no longer required and they're probably not wanted. Korea is a place where we've had forces for many, many years. Sadly, we are still occupying the former headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Army. That's a frightening thought if you stop and consider it. We need to start scaling these back. So you cut your defense outlays from the outside in. You don't go after your scientific industrial base, which is critical to research, development, and production. You look at where you've got forces, and then that's where you scale back. And we could save hundreds of billions of dollars by doing it.
And you would balance investment focus a little bit more investment on the air and the naval side and away from the ground troops.
Well, we have to understand that it's not a question of focusing away. There is no requirement to expand the ground force. We are not about conquering foreign territory, occupying it, and changing it. That's not what we do as Americans. We have 675,000 men on a normal basis in the Army and the Marines. That's an enormous number. It needs to be reorganized. We need to get more out of it. We need less overhead. We need more teeth, less tail. These things are true. But we also need to understand that they've got to operate within that air-naval framework.
Right.
Because our supremacy in the air and at sea is absolutely vital. It's a condition we want to be able to impose when we need it.
Right.
That's something we don't want to sacrifice.
Doug, thanks very, very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Are President Obama's new ethics rules for political appointees working against them? We'll take a look coming up.